want to produce cars, you need a good supply of electricity, you need a good port, you need a glass factory maybe, you need the engines, etc. Now that takes us a little bit into globalization issues, but the government is in an excellent position here in order to help these coordination failures by creating the so-called business enabling environment. And the main design element is this new term. Well, it's not that new actually. It was developed in 1995 by Evans, in which he talked about embedded autonomy. Now, embedded in the sense that the private sector is in bed with the public sector, so to speak, but the government still has autonomy. But that autonomy is not abused. It is used in a very positive way. And remember, even the government does not know that what is it that it wants to focus on, okay? As I said, the government is not a very efficient entity when it comes to the private sector, when it comes to entrepreneurship and innovation, etc. But the government can act a very strong enabler. So the issue here is not whether government support works or not. Government support works only if these 13 design elements are present in the institutional framework. So by the institutional framework, I mean the parameters of these 13 best practice principles, which any industrial policy must include in order to help support the private sector in such a way that it will have positive effects on productivity and total factor productivity, all these micro issues which I don't think is relevant to go into now. So we look at the generic design elements, and the generic design elements basically that these are elements across all governments that must be included. Oops. The first one was government ownership, okay? So the thing is that this industrial policy, the owner of these support programs must be at the highest level of government, at the level of the prime minister, at the level even of the president. And if you look at the example of East Asian countries, you see that these industrial policy committees and commissions, etc., they were very closely monitored and evaluated at the highest level of government. So ownership is very important, and I will talk about it later a little bit. Just like monetary policy, in which it is you have a minister of economy or a central bank governor, just like the Federal Reserve in the US, or here the governor of the central bank, in which monetary policy is owned by a very powerful organization, or fiscal policy, in which it is owned by the Ministry of Finance. So industrial policy must be owned by either the ministry or even higher than the ministry level, at the prime minister's level. So this is a very important generic element which must be included in the support programs. The second design element is the coordination and the deliberation councils, okay? And these are communication mechanisms in which there is information exchange between the private sector and the public sector. And the third element is it should have both incentive and conditionality structures, in the sense that this is also known as the carrot and stick policy, in which you give an incentive to the private sector, but the incentive must also include the conditionality. If, for example, if certain targets are not met, then the incentive will stop. So it's the carrot and stick policy. So these generic design elements are of utmost importance. Now we look at the top design principles. You provide support only to new activities. And new activities does not mean the creation of a new product. Okay? It means two things. First of all, it means that a product which is not produced domestically, it's produced maybe in Germany or in China, you start producing that in Jordan, that becomes as a new product activity. And the second definition, a related definition, is that it's an existing product, but it is produced by new modes of production, by new technology, by a better way of doing things. We prepare critical benchmarks for success and failure in the sense that, and here the success is not that important because everyone assumes that it will succeed, okay? Everyone is optimistic when he or she starts a new business, but the failure is much more important here. And here you must be able to tell when the support program must be terminated, okay? So that's very important so that the government will not incur very high costs. Use built-in sunset clauses. By the way, all of this that I talk about, I'll be talking only, I'm talking about headlines only, okay? It is published in a document here, which is being distributed in the opening ceremony, so you have all these in details and the programs which are in print. The third element is the sunset clauses. Sunset clauses, it means that if a certain period elapses, say after 12 months, the support will automatically disappear, okay? So you don't have to wait for it to be renewed, etc. Now, that gives a lot of incentive to the entrepreneur, knowing that after 12 months or 2 years, the support is automatically going to stop. And here we target activities, not sectors. Again, you might think that this is a technical issue, but it's not. And when you talk about sectors, you are talking about the tourism sector, for example. So it is very general in the sense that you cannot target the sector, but you target the activities in the sector. For example, you give, say, training to the taxi drivers. You give training, for example, to the receptionists. You give training to the tour operators, which are all part and parcel of the tourism sector. So you don't target the sector. You have to be very specific. And the reason for that is because growth is generated by the potential effect of these activities. And again, these are discussed in length in my paper. And here a related item to the activities is that the government should support activities that generate spillover and demonstration effects. A spillover effects in the sense that it has to do something with the coordination failure, that you start a technology, you start a new activity, but the rest of the economy should also benefit from that. And the demonstration effect is that people see, it's a copycat effect in the sense that people see that this way of doing business or this technology is working, so other people will start adopting that technology. Choose competent implementing agencies. Number 6, okay, we choose competent implementing agencies, that's number 6, and that sounds obvious, but you have to make a qualifier here in the sense that if your tax authorities, for example, if the Minister of Finance is not very efficient, you don't use tax incentives, okay? You use some other incentive, which may be a second best option. For example, use an incentive from the Jordan Development Bank, as an example. I don't even know if a Jordan Development Bank exists. But in this context, that it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to use the best solution if the implementing agency does not have the qualifications in order to implement that incentive. The 7th design principle is that you need to monitor these implementing agencies closely. So even if a support program is initiated by the Minister of Industry and Trade, it has to be monitored, and who is going to monitor that? It has to be monitored by the Prime Minister's office, and maybe at the higher level by the President or the King or the ruler and so forth. And this is where it becomes institutionalized. Remember, when I talk about institutions, I'm not talking about a building, or I'm not talking about a physical entity. I'm talking about a way of doing things. Okay? For example, whenever it comes to me, like driving, for example, when you drive in the streets, I keep saying that in the Arab world, especially in Dubai these days, driving is not institutionalized, okay? So whatever penalties you put, whatever rules you put, people will not heed them unless it is institutionalized. So this is what I'm talking about when I'm talking about the support to the private sector. And maintain clear channels of communication. So even if a support program is initiated, even if it's given to a certain sector, there needs to be these support programs, or there needs to be very open channels of communication. And this is one of the secrets of success of the Dubai economy, in which I explain in greater detail in my book, in which there is always very clear and broad channels of cooperation between the private sector and the government. And here we minimize the cost of picking losers, okay? And the government does not have a crystal ball, okay? And it will try to identify the champions and which companies have the best chance of promoting a certain product. And that is very difficult to tell because you have so many other variables which are playing in the market. So even if you have the best incentive structure, even if you have the best support program, it doesn't mean that you are going. So there are going to be costs, there are going to be failures, and the trick for the government is to minimize these costs. Okay, so there will inevitably be, always there will be costs. But the secret is to minimize these costs. And finally, we adopt programs with the capacity to renew themselves, Why? Because we are always working in a changing environment, okay, because of globalization, because of the internet, etc., etc. So if a support program is initiated in the beginning, it doesn't mean that it is set in stone. It should always be flexible, but it should be within the institutional framework. The existing structure is a top-down approach, as I talked, in most countries in the Arab world, in which you have the principal-agent problem. The government is the principal, and the private sector is the agent. And here I go a little bit deeper into the generic components that I discussed: ownership, cooperation councils, and the carrot and sticks, in which you will have incentives and conditionality. So the carrot and stick, you just imagine a big stick, okay? Extending a big stick, one side is a carrot, jazar yani, and the other stick, and the other side is stick, asai. So you give the incentive, but if the incentive does not work, you hit a little bit with that stick. Okay, so that's the idea. And the other components that I talked about, the formulation of the support programs, this formulation has to be in very close cooperation with the private sector, okay? Those days are gone in which the government, say, plans that this is what it wants. And that system was called communism and a command-type economy, which is gone now. So the government cannot formulate policies on its own. It has to do it in very close consultation with the private sector. Monitoring and evaluation, as I said, it has to be monitored and evaluated very closely. Why? Because of changing conditions in the evaluation process, and monitoring so as to see where are the shortcomings and what can be done in order to solve these problems. And finally, deployment, that how you deploy or how you use these support programs. And there are hundreds of examples in the Asian countries in which you need to really work at a micro level, okay? So people have to be delegated specifically to follow the support programs with clear performance indicators. Concluding remarks. We see that because of the global financial crisis and the aftershocks of the global financial crisis. And again, as the minister mentioned, I was very happy to say that the role of the government has increased. Okay, for example, in the US, okay, they always believed in the market type economy, in laissez-faire, in market cap. I'm a very strong believer in a market type of economy. But by necessity or by force, the US government, for example, was forced to buy General Motors. It was forced to buy a lot of banks. The same situation in Europe. Okay? Now, but the government is not very well equipped in order to manage these entities. The government is not a business entity. The government, the role of the government is rules and regulations and policing and courts, and to make sure that it does a good institutional framework, to make sure that it has an enabling environment, which is, by the way, tomorrow's lecture, how you measure governance and how you measure the performance of the government. And finally, the government must be more effective in bridging this gap between policy on the books and policy on the ground, okay? In the sense that you have rules, you have regulations, you have support programs, etc., which are all on the books, okay? Hacky, so to speak. But how to implement that on the ground, okay? That is a special talent in which it needs very, very intimate involvement with the private sector, but not forgetting the embedded autonomy issue. So the government should not act as a decision maker, as a final decision maker, but of course the government is the only entity which put rules and regulations and so forth, okay? So I will not be able to imprison someone if they don't follow my support programs. But the government will be able to do that, unless if it does it with the consent of the private sector. And this will be the topic of tomorrow's issue. Thank you very much.
أشكر الدكتور أوهاد على هذه المعلومات الطيبة. ولا تكتمل هذه المحاضرة قيمة ولا ثمرة إلا من خلال مشاركاتكم وتعقيباتكم وأسئلتكم القيمة إن شاء الله. والدكتور أوهاد على أهبة الاستعداد للإجابة والاستماع إلى أسئلتكم، ونفتح المجال للتعقيب. تفضل.
صالح محمدي، معلش تحكي بالعربي إذا سمحت.
تفضل تفضل.
السؤال الأول، استشف من كتابك أنه بالرجوع إلى مصطلح الكتاب المقدس.
مش سامع، سوري مش سامع.
لنا والأجداد عن طريق لا تكلم العربية وأنت عشت في اللغة وبالأخص فلسطين. السؤال الثاني، بوجود الرياح الصديقة لا نستغلها، وهي لا تضر البيئة وتعطينا أسعار تقريبية.
مش سامع، مش فاهم عليك.
سماعات للدكتور بالله إذا سمحتي. سماعات للدكتور إذا سمحتي.
أنا فاهم عليه. I can understand بس مش سامع صوته. صوته مش يعني إنه ترجمة it's not an issue.
طيب. السؤال الخامس.
ما شاء الله.
السؤال الأول.
لا خليك بالخامس بليز خليك بالخامس. I know.
خليك في الخامس. خليك في الخامس.
That's not for that for you.
Please, thank you.
رجاء يا اخوان، رجاء كل واحد يحط حبة حلو فمه ويسكت. رجاء يا اخوان. وجود الطاقة الشمسية والقمرية وطاقة الرياح الصديقة للبيئة، وهي لا تحتاج إلى تدفقات نقدية، وهي تتحكم بنا بالأسعار وارتفاعها، فلماذا لا نستغلها؟ وهي لا تدخل البيئة، لا تضر البيئة، وتعطينا أسعار تقريبية. تحول العلاقة العكسية إلى طردية والطردية إلى عكسية، أي كلما زادت التدفقات النقدية زادت الأرباح، مما انعكس على الاقتصاد واضطربت الأوضاع الاقتصادية في العالم. That's it's correct or not correct. السلام عليكم.
يعطيك العافية. أشكرك على المجهود في كتابة الأسئلة والمجهود في إسماعنا صوتك الطيب، وأفتح المجال للدكتور للإجابة.
شكرا أخ سوري اسمك؟ صالح محمد عيد. إذا بتلاحظ أنا اسمي بليان، اسم أرمني، فأنا اليوم بدي أجاوبك بالأرمني كل الأسئلة اللي قلت أنا. فزي ما قلت إنه بحكي عربي أنا بس في مصطلحات بالإنجليزي ويعني كتير صعب بكون لي، بس يعني الأسئلة نصهم فهمت. بس ننساش إنه المحاضرة اليوم على الإطار المؤسسي. It's institutional framework. I don't see the relevance. مش شايف يعني الأسئلة اللي سألتهم أنت they might be very good questions، يعني أسئلة كتير كويسة، بس they don't have anything to do with today's presentation.
Thank you very much for your comments and details which talking about the role of the government sector. If I have some comments here, please. If we go back to the history, if we remember the Great Depression in 1929, we noticed at that time the global crisis, it is taking place in everywhere, unemployment and everything is bad at that time. And at that time, I remember that Keynes said that the government must take role in the economy.
It must do what?
The government must take role in the economy. Take the leader role of the government must be taken. And in 1990 and above, we noticed that all the countries going to the globalization and liberalization of the economy, to the market economy. Now again, we are calling the government to intervene in the economy. Now I am noticing everywhere even the private sector are trying to benefit from the government. They are not doing many things to improve the environment of the business in the countries, but they are waiting the government to show to them the support in the economy. As Jordan, as Dubai, they didn't expect this crisis internationally. Nobody expected this crisis. When it is started in Lehman Brothers Bank in USA, we feel that this is only in USA, but it is spread like cancer in everywhere. Now, what is the role of the government nowadays in Dubai and in GCC countries and in Jordan? We want you to highlight the effects of the government roles in these days, while I'm thinking that the private sector cannot do anything in these days. Thank you.
Yeah, you see, when you mentioned the Great Depression back in 1929, immediately after the Great Depression, the government enacted a rule regulation called the Glass-Steagall Act, in which it tried to liberalize, in which it tried to deregulate regulate the banking sector, in which it started regulating the banking sector. So the private sector was constrained to some extent. It was held back, the private sector. Why? So that they will not go very deep into areas in which they don't have expertise, in which they don't have core competencies. Now, in 1999, this Glass-Steagall Act, which was repealed by the Clinton administration, and that expanded the role of the government, the role of banks. And commercial banks and investment banks, etc., the demarcation line between them was blurred. Now again, I don't want to go into economic history, because this is a presentation or a debate needs to be on the institutional framework for private sector support for industrial policy. So I will come back immediately to the institutional framework. You compared Dubai with the rest of the world, okay? Dubai and most of the countries in the GCC have been using a model called as state capitalism that always has been government support for the industries. Unlike in Jordan, to some extent, unlike in Syria, unlike in Lebanon, so I don't want to compare Dubai with Europe or the USA, so let's compare Dubai with the other Arab countries. So state capitalism, or compare Dubai or the UAE with Egypt, for example, okay? There has been in Egypt a lot of government support, but it has not been done the right way. This is the problem. So when we talk about institutional framework, I would say the best practices are these 13 best practices. Now, the thing to remember is that these principles, I did not put these principles, okay? These principles, they were taken, gleaned, so to speak, from the experiences of Latin American countries. Some Latin American countries and East Asian countries, okay? Now, some people even argue that the reason of the slowdown in Japan to this day is because of industrial policy. Okay, mind you, I'm not telling you that this is a solution. It is one solution. Because the reason in Japan it did not work so well is maybe because they didn't do it the right way. But they did it the right way in Singapore, they did it the right way in South Korea, and in some parts of Latin America, and even Brazil, in which you don't have to say that the government has to be small. You know, Singapore is a small country. Okay, South Korea is a relatively small country, but Brazil is a huge country. And the Latin American experience shows that some countries succeeded. Now, this takes us into the issues of import substitution, export promotion, etc., which I don't think it's appropriate